Hello, everyone, and welcome to another talk in the 2026 Voices in Vegan Studies Speaker Series. My name is Jonathan Dickstein. I am Assistant Professor of Jain and Vegan Studies here at Arihanta, and I am also the lead organizer for our Vegan Studies Initiative, which is now in its third year. In 2024 was our first year of our Voices in Vegan Studies Speaker Series, which really was a popular form of programming that we were offering. And we took a break in 2025 so that our Compassion Studies program could do their series. And now we're back in the thick of things midway through our series in 2026. I'm really excited for our talk today and really encourage those to check our website and look at events coming up. In a month's time, Vasile Stanescu will give our next talk, and there'll be talks following that as well. Now, for those of you unfamiliar, I just briefly want to mention the kind of function or the purpose of the series, which is kind of mainly twofold, or the way that I've conceived it. It's on the one hand, a way to bring contemporary topics or current topics in Jain studies and vegan studies, both to the general public, which is really what we do at Arihanta in general, trying to make all these forms of education more accessible, but also to bring it to the Jain community, which is a large portion of our audience, to kind of let them know what's going on in contemporary issues in, say, environmental studies, vegan studies, race studies, gender studies, and so on. And then sometimes we have speakers who come more from religious perspectives or from the Jain world who want to share how kind of their values have things to say, or their practices have had things to say about, say, veganism or animal advocacy, animal ethics, and so on. So I really view it as this kind of two-way street of assisting one another overall, just for the purpose of building community and empowering individuals to take action for animals, for themselves, and for each other. So without further ado, I would really like to take a moment to introduce our speaker today, Zipporah Weisberg. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be participating in this wonderful speaker series. And also shout out to Vasily for putting us in touch in the first place and alerting me to the Arihanta Institute, which is doing such fabulous work. So it's really great to be participating. Thank you.
Yes, great. I think Vasile's here today, so he probably received
Yeah,
a
I saw him.
shout out immediately.
Yes.
So today's talk is one actually dear to my own heart. I know some of the individuals here at Arihanta in our graduate program, students, just people who've attended, are really interested in the topic of animal sanctuaries. And the talk today is titled "Blessed Beasts and Sacred Spaces: A Theologico-Political Exploration of Animal Sanctuaries." Now, Zipporah Weisberg is an adjunct professor in the Department of Classics and Religious Studies at the University of Ottawa. From 2023 to 24, she held a one-year limited term appointment at the rank of Assistant Professor of Critical Animal Studies in the Department of Sociology at Brock University. Zipporah completed her PhD in Social and Political Thought at York University in 2013 and was the inaugural postdoctoral fellow in animal ethics in the Department of Philosophy at Queen's University from 2013 to 15. Her areas of specialization include critical animal studies, the critical theory of the early Frankfurt School, and existentialism and phenomenology. Zipporah has published on a wide range of topics, including animal sanctuaries as forms of political refusal, climate justice and animal justice, the ethics and politics of cultured meat, the benefits and harms of animal-assisted therapy, the ethical and ontological implications of biotechnology, and the psychopathology of speciesism. She is currently working on a book project on sanctuaries as a form of political refusal. And hopefully we get a little taste of that in today's talk. So before we get started, I will turn it over to you in a second. I just want to remind everyone in the audience that we're going to field questions throughout the talk. So please use the question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen to drop questions that I will then kind of relay at the end of the talk. You can also use the Q&A for comments. I feel sometimes questions there's like a lot of pressure. What am I going to say? There's a question mark at the end of it, but you don't have to say that. It can be a comment, a reflection, some kind of musing, and then we certainly can engage that in conversation as well. So once again, thank you so much for being here, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Again, a real pleasure to be here and to be sharing this work, which is developing as we speak. So, as Jonathan mentioned, I've already done some work on sanctuaries as a form of political refusal. So, there's an article out there. This is not meant to be a plug, but just to give a sense of my trajectory. And now I'm trying to develop the ideas in the article into a book. And then recently came to I think from teaching in the classics and religious studies department, came back to questions around religious thought and other animals. I do have a background in Jain studies. That was my master's many moons ago. And I'm still interested very much in, actually even more so in a way, after having taken a bit of a detour and looked at more political questions in these ancient religious traditions that really have, in the case of Jainism, such a powerful ethical framework that is really unparalleled, I think, among other traditions. And also, I'm interested in Jewish thought and how we might work with some of the stories, biblical stories, Talmudic commentary, and so on, to think creatively about human and non-human animal relations. Perhaps Jewish thought is even counterintuitive to some, or Judeo-Christian thought as it's understood, because a lot of biases tend to be attributed to these traditions. But I think there's a lot more there that we can uncover. So that's my goal today. I'll be focusing especially on Jewish thought and some Christian interpretations. So Jainism will hopefully be part of the larger book project that I'm working on now. Great. So I just wanted to say that this project, the book project, is dedicated to Soraya. Rest in peace. May her memory be forever a blessing. She's a sheep, a lamb that I had the pleasure of meeting and forming a deep relationship with in a sanctuary in Spain several years ago. She sadly passed away, but my connection with her was very transformative, and I learned so much from her. Okay, I wanted to start with just to give you a sense of the structure of the talk. So we'll be
Would
looking
you like
at
to
some
share your
definite.
slides first? Are they on already?
Are you not seeing the
Oh, I
slides?
see them now. I'm so sorry. I clicked away.
Ah, was everybody okay? I hope everybody was able
Just
to
ignore
see.
me. I'm always the one.
Okay. No, but do let me
Continue.
know if there's,
I
or
will.
if my earbuds stop working, whatever, any technical issues. Okay. So, yes, I wanted to start with just to give you a sense of the structure. It's a lengthy talk, but I'll try to keep it within 40 to 45 minutes max. So I'll start with some definitions, caveats, and qualifiers. This is something that if anyone has heard me talk on sanctuaries before, this will be familiar because I like to frame a little bit how I'm approaching my analysis of sanctuaries, because there are a lot of questions around sanctuaries and their role. And I kind of want to position myself a little bit vis-a-vis the debate around sanctuaries. Then I move on to talk about sacredness, sacred spaces, sacred work. Then I talk about blessedness. And then I'm also working with Simone Weil, who was originally Jewish, a French a thinker who lived a very short but very intense and full life, who converted to Christianity and had some really interesting things to say theologically about relationships between, in her case, among human beings. But I'm adapting some of her thought to relations between humans and other animals. So the expectation of the good, and then we'll be talking a little bit about her work, and then the fulfillment of the redemptive promise. So that's looking at this is a new kind of framework that I'm exploring how to perhaps position the sanctuary movement as part of a larger secular redemptive project. Let's see. And I'm curious what your feedback might be after, because again, this is fairly new territory, this part of my research. Good. Okay, so starting with part one. I wanted to say straight up that I'm very well aware that sanctuaries are diverse and imperfect institutions. They are subject to many limitations. So I am talking about sanctuaries very broadly, just for the sake of brevity and clarity, but I'm fully aware of the fact that some sanctuaries operate more effectively than others, that they vary greatly depending on the kinds of animals they house and the resources they have at their disposal. So an elephant sanctuary is going to have different needs than a sanctuary for rats. There's such a huge spectrum. And of course, there are many places that call themselves sanctuaries that aren't actually sanctuaries. They're glorified petting zoos or worse. So those don't count. When I'm talking about sanctuaries, I'm talking about authentic sanctuaries that are genuinely committed to not just rescuing animals and providing them refuge, but really enabling their flourishing and agency. Okay, so in the book, I will be explaining in much more detail the huge variety and some of the challenges to even doing a project of this nature. Um, so there are, and the other thing I do think it's important to point out is even the what I'm calling authentic sanctuaries are often forced to participate. In fact, they're always forced to participate on some level in practices that are highly problematic. So ear tagging, for in many cases, that's not across the board, but sanctuaries are forced through bylaws, for example, to practice ear tagging, and they might fight against it, but they may lose their license to function as a sanctuary unless they either keep the ear tags in that animals that are coming from exploitative environments might have in their ears, or they have to put them in. So this is a really difficult dilemma, and I think most vegans are familiar with the many day-to-day dilemmas that we face in trying to uphold vegan principles and practices in a non-vegan world. And of course, they limit animals' freedom, right? So when we get into philosophical discussions about freedom, I'm not going to get into that so much today, but we need to sort of ask what that means to really uh, effectively, create an enclosed space for other animals and determine that space ourselves, maybe with some input from the animals, but limited by bylaws, by resources, and so on. And so, as Miriam Jones, I always like to quote her. She's the co-founder with Patrice Jones of Vine Sanctuary in Springfield, Vermont, has noted the best sanctuaries, the ones that make the utmost effort, can really, at best, all they can offer is a fake freedom. The best sanctuaries, at best, can only offer a fake freedom. So that's sort of they're not ideal spaces, and I want to be clear that I recognize that they're not perfect for all of these reasons and more. This is just, I'm not going to go into any statistics here, but this is an example of sort of where sanctuaries are concentrated. The majority seem to be in the United States in terms of numbers, and then you have in Europe as well, some in Canada, and then spread throughout the rest of the world. And of course, in India, there's an ancient sanctuary tradition, which again, I'm not going to get into today, but will hopefully form part of my research in the future. Okay, so what I'm interested in mostly when it comes to sanctuaries is not at the moment the specifics, the concrete details, although those are very important. I'm following Ilan Abrel's characterization of sanctuaries being important materially and symbolically. So in his seminal work on sanctuaries, he notes that a sanctuary is both, quote, a specific bounded place or state of being, and an ideological ethical mode of being. And that's what I'm interested in. In the specific bounded place, that will come into play when I'm talking about sacredness and sanctuary, the etymology of the terms refer to a separate space at any rate, but also a state of being and an ideological ethical mode of being. For particularly human beings in that case, so that the way humans comport themselves and the ideological bulwark of that comportment towards other animals. They provide, of course, in more concrete terms, urgently needed care and refuge for survivors of the horrors of the animal industrial complex. And occasionally, when animals are born on the sanctuaries, then they, happily avoid those horrors, and they're also home for those animals as well. But by and large, they're meant to be safe spaces for animals that themselves escape or are assisted in their escape or otherwise arrive at the sanctuary. Like human sanctuary cities, sanctuaries are also an act of solidarity. So this is the symbolic element that I'm most interested in. It's an act of solidarity, even if your sanctuary isn't perfect, right? And you can't take all the animals in, whatever the case may be, you're limited by this or that. You're showing solidarity with the other animals, even the ones that are not in the sanctuary. You're showing a solidarity with all the animals that are, entangled or trapped in the inferno, let's say, of the animal industrial complex. And that's a term introduced by Noske in 1996, Barbara Noske. So it's an act of solidarity in human sanctuaries with marginalized communities and an act of protest against harmful policies and practices against vulnerable communities. Typo. I knew I'd miss one at least. Let's see how many others come up. So I'm interested in the symbolic element. Yeah, of course, for the other animals, the animals that are in the sanctuaries and those that are not in the sanctuaries, however symbolic we might view them as humans, really only doesn't mean so much to them, right? It's that's sort of, but I think it's important for humans to create a narrative around the work that we're doing with. I don't like to say on behalf of, but let's say with other animals towards multi-species liberation. So the symbolic element to me is extremely important, even if when it comes to the animals themselves, that may not resonate. Um, it's the practical aspects of it that resonate, and then the relationships of care and the development of agency and so on that are most relevant, I think, to other animals. I want to, I'm already noting at the very beginning that another one, aspirational and redemptive projects. I thought I went over this with a fine tooth comb. Anyway, somewhere along the way, the AL got deleted. So they're aspirational and redemptive projects. What do I mean by that? First and foremost, following Ava Meyer, sanctuaries are not end stations. We are not aiming to arrive at a place where we have millions of sanctuaries and that's it. We've reached the end of the historical project of animal liberation. Not at all. Obviously not, right? Because sanctuaries are, by their very nature, an interim measure. They're responding to a crisis or a catastrophe, and one that has been, ongoing for thousands of years at the end of the day when it comes to humans' violent relationship to other animals. So I see them as, especially in the moment we are today at this historical juncture, an emergency response. Okay, so they're not in themselves end stations. That's very, very important. However, as I will talk about later in the talk, there is something Edenic about them. I'm very interested in linking sanctuaries without conflating them to earlier conceptions or the creation story and the notion of a garden. I'll explain what that means later, but even when I'm talking about that, I'm not suggesting in any way that these are utopian, they are utopias, even if they might be utopian in some way. So like veganism and animal liberation, they are themselves aspirational. This is a notion that Robert Jones and Lori Gruen discuss in a really interesting and important article that they co-published in 2015 on the imperfect, let's say, the impossibility of pure veganism, right? We all know that, and perhaps those of you in the audience who aren't vegan, there can be a misconception about veganism that vegans consider themselves to be pure, sort of ethically pure, and practicing almost an ascetic life somehow, like with an ascetic commitment to renouncing all animal-based products. So that is the commitment, but in reality, it's not necessarily an ascetic commitment, but the commitment is to a boycott and a renunciation. But it's a political act of solidarity. It's a political protest. It's an ethical statement. And it's impossible to fully achieve, to fully realize. If you go to the doctor, if you ride a bus, there are animal products everywhere all the time. And if one has a cat companion, what do you feed the cat, right? So it's very complicated and impossible, actually, in a non-vegan world to be fully vegan in that sense. So I want to say sanctuaries also are aspirational. I've seen many different kinds of sanctuaries, and even if the intention is there, they're not necessarily fulfilling the promise as one would hope, right? Maybe there's confinement, for example, of an animal that has some kind of behavioral issue or is in conflict, I prefer to say, rather than pathologizing them or paternalistically referring to them as having some kind of behavioral issue, but rather maybe there's a situation of conflict or there's some reason that an animal needs to be set apart. And then sometimes you find that animals are confined in smaller spaces. And for me, that's very troubling. But that's just an example of what people sometimes feel are necessary and ideally temporary measures to ensure the safety, for example, of all the residents, including the animal that's been put aside and maybe even in some kind of cage, right? But sanctuaries are part of but even if they are themselves aspirational, even if they are imperfect, and flawed in so many ways, my argument here is that they're part of the larger aspirational and redemptive project. So I'm using aspiration and redemption in two senses. The sanctuaries themselves are aspirational, meaning they can't fulfill their own promise because we live in an imperfect world. Um, the project of animal liberation is aspirational. We aspire to liberate all other animals and humans as well from structures of oppression, to create a new kind of world. And the redemptive part is really for me sort of the newest area that I'm exploring. And I'm, in the leftist tradition, Marxian thought, there is a lot of discussion of, or there's a lot of framing of political projects um, as being redemptive, as being teleological, as having a goal, let's say. And I like the word redemptive because of the multiple meanings. So redemptive as in a teleological project, there's an aim, and also redemptive as in liberation, as in redemption. So for me, there's multiple layers to this term. As you'll see as I go through, I'm really focusing this work, this part of my project, on terminology. The discussion of sanctuaries as refusal, which I'll briefly show you in a moment, just a glimpse of, is not so etymology focused, not so word focused, but in this case, I'm really interested in terminology. So redemptive sanctuaries are utopian, but they are not utopias. And I don't think we should be ashamed of saying that. That's why I add, and this is not a bad thing, because tends to be a fear around the idea of utopia or the idea of aspiring towards utopia. And I want to say, actually, why? I think utopia is a really important motivating force, as long as there's always what in the Frankfurt School they would call a negative dialectical relationship to that notion. So you're always questioning what that is. You don't arrive in an absolute in the Hegelian sense, but following from the left Hegelians and the Marxian tradition, you're continually transforming towards whatever this goal might be, and the goal itself might transform. Okay, so this is just a 3-point review of this other work that I've already done more research on and published in about as well, but I don't have time to get into it in any great detail. So I just the sort of crux of the argument is that by existing at all, sanctuaries present a refusal of the existing paradigm, which is defined by human supremacism and animal exterminationism. That's a term I'm not going to get into defining here, exterminationism, animal exterminationism, but it's a term that I use frequently. But I'll just say that it means we not only exterminate animals bodily, but we exterminate them conceptually as subjects. So even if we're infinitely reproducing them, in the case of animals bred for labs or animals bred for agriculture, we are actually, through that mass proliferation of life, we're exterminating them because they're just objects, not subjects. Sanctuaries are a protest against that which is. So that's a Marcusean phrase. Sanctuaries as refusal is built on the idea following Herbert Marcuse, early Frankfurt School thinker and leader of the New Left in the 60s, who he coined this phrase. And refusal was something that he was interested in and he saw happening at the time, and he sort of put it into a nice theoretical framework. And so I'm saying that sanctuaries participate in this larger political refusal. They're a glimmer of that which ought to be. So the is and the ought. This is a tension that you see a lot in Marcusean work, and I like to build on that idea. They're both a negation of that which negates us and an affirmation of that which affirms us. So a negation of that which negates us, they're a negation of the negation of our animality, for example, a negation of the negation of our kinship with other animals, of the compassion that we might feel towards them, of the curiosity we might have, of the experience of enchantment and awe and wonder. So they negate those negations, and they're an affirmation of that which affirms us. So they affirm the idea that another animal is wondrous, whether a pig or a rat or a chicken. They affirm the connection that we might feel and we tend to feel if given the chance with other animals, and so on and so forth. Oops, hang on. Oh, it's not going. Okay. So that was part one. I want to get now to the main focus of this talk, which is sacred spaces and sacred work. Okay, so first of all, why religious terminology and framing? People might be asking, yeah. So you don't have. I'm not religious. I don't believe in God, and I don't practice um, I'm not a practicing Jew, for example. But I think there's a lot to be learned from religious thought. I mean, these are ancient traditions that date back thousands of years, and I think that we're too quick, often, especially on the left, to reject any religious thought as sort of, and Marx, I think, is partly responsible for that, for somehow clouding, our reason or leading us astray. Religious thought, and in this case, particularly Jewish thought, is extremely complex and multi-layered and multifaceted and multidimensional. So I think there's a rich source of human knowledge, a lot of problematic elements, no question. But if we just dismiss it entirely, then we're, I think, doing ourselves a disservice. So I'm interested in exploring religious framing and terminology as a resource, as a source of a deeper examination of these fundamental questions. Because frankly, secular political thought doesn't always, it's missing something, in my view. And this is very much my experience, but there's something missing. And I do feel that religious terminology and framing actually help to fill that gap. So they terminology and framing point to something deep, fundamental, and essential, in this case, in the sanctuary project, in sanctuary spaces, in the work being done in sanctuaries, and most of all, and most importantly, in the animals themselves. I'm trying to get at something, I don't want to say primordial, but something that religion, and the term religion anyway is a bit of a misnomer, because it's actually sort of the historically the not the aberration, but the exception to be secular, right? So most human communities have been what we now call religious. So they've had a series of sets of beliefs and values and practices, rituals, um, and there's a reason for that, because people are searching for meaning, and and there's a depth that I think religious language, religious study, religious practice can reach that perhaps secular practices and so on can't. Sacredness, blessedness, and redemption can also be understood in secular terms. So I'm not trying to create a new religious gospel, not at all. But I'm actually trying to, and I don't want to say reappropriate, that's too strong of a term, but to apply these terms to a secular project of liberation for all animals. Some sanctuaries, especially the Jain Pandropoli, are grounded in religious belief and practice. So ahimsa, karma. I'm not going to talk about that here, but there's a direct link between sanctuaries, animal sanctuaries in particular, and in this case, the Jain tradition, which, as I said before, really stands out for its prioritization of non-harm to all living beings. That's why I studied Jainism, because I had been an animal activist for a long time and was not quite, was extremely horrified by what I was seeing, was just the footage of animal exploitation and just the tortures we inflict on other animals. And then suddenly someone introduced me to this incredible ancient tradition that puts as its primary and most important precept not harming any living being. And I thought, oh wow, okay, I have faith in humanity again. So that's definitely going to be part of the project as I continue. Just the last point here, religious terminology and framing highlights the diabolical nature of our treatment of other animals. I'm also interested in evil. What is evil? We can name evil for what it is. I think if we allow ourselves a little bit more freedom to use this kind of language, and we can also name goodness for what it is. I'm interested in good and evil, and I think the way we treat animals is evil, and I'm not afraid to say it. I need to do research more on the history of the term evil and in different translations and so on. But I think it's important to call evil what it is, call animal abuse what it is, which is evil. That I'm not going to talk about so much today, but I just want to flag that as something I think is relevant, and what religious thought and terminology help us navigate. Okay, so now looking at sacredness. Sacred space is doing sacred work. Just moving my window here so I can see my slide. Okay, so here we get to the terminology. So the Hebrew word kadosh translates to set apart, removed from ordinary use, marked off, and belonging elsewhere. The Latin term is a kind of translation, if you will, of kadosh. The Latin root of the term sacred, or sacer, refers to that which sets apart, consecrates, or makes holy. So it's a different grammatical point here. So this is doing the work. It's the verb. It's a noun, but the root is the verb. So it makes something holy. So whatever those details are, that's not important. What I'm interested in here is set apart. something that is sacred is set apart and it's removed from ordinary use. That's extremely important when it comes to other animals in the current context, right? The ordinary use of animals is systemic violence, is to instrumentalize them, to use them as food commodities, as research subjects, animal models, so to speak, and so on and so forth. We have all sorts of horrible uses for other animals. And what I appreciate about sanctuaries is that they immediately refuse, that by nature, they remove them from that ordinary, they create a space in which the animals that are removed from ordinary use can then live in a different state of being. And these animals, I like to play with the idea that they belong elsewhere, right? So the idea of sacredness is about belonging elsewhere. And my argument is that, of course, it's not just the animals in the sanctuaries that belong elsewhere. It's all animals belong elsewhere. For now, the best we can do when we're trying to, for example, figure out where to put, like where a chimpanzee that was used for HIV research or an elephant that's being retired from the circus, where do they belong? Well, they ultimately belong in their home, in their habitat, right? But in the interim, at the very least, they belong in a sanctuary, not in a zoo. Yeah, so I'm really interested also in the idea of belonging. Animals, we have alienated ourselves from animals. We are in a relationship of estrangement with other animals. And they're especially worse off for it, but we are as well in different ways. And I like the idea of belonging. So sanctuaries for me really capture all of these aspects of the notion of kadosh, which also is often translated as holy. But technically, that's actually not the meaning of the word. Now, of course, a being can be set apart for death, for sacrifice. So animals that were lambs, for example, that were sacrificed and still are across many traditions, are considered kadosh, holy, sacred, but it's not them in themselves. It's not the specific lamb that is holy, not at all. It's the taking that lamb out of the mundane, of the ordinary use of the lamb for other purposes, agricultural purposes usually, and setting it apart to be killed in a horrible way, right? And that's obviously not what I support. I want to reclaim the idea of sacredness from this violent practice of killing. I don't know why humans are so intent on killing animals, and we have been for thousands and thousands of years. The whole notion of animal sacrifice just befuddles me, really. So they're set apart not for death in this context, but for life and for love. The being must not itself be especially virtuous, morally upright, or spiritually elevated to be considered sacred. This is really important. So this relieves animals of the burden of proving their worthiness, right? Oh, this animal is really intelligent, like humans, and therefore we shouldn't, it should have some rights, right? People are making that claim strategically. I understand in the Non-Human Rights Project to get at least elephants and chimpanzees and cetaceans out of harm's way. But beyond it being a strategic measure, it's really problematic to have to prove that an animal is worthy of life. They're deemed lebensunwert des Lebens, life unworthy of life, which was a term used in the Holocaust by the Nazis. And this deems them worthy of life without having to prove anything. And Simone Weil's work also reinforces that later in her universalism. Sanctuary itself, so sanctuarium is from sanctus, holy, consecrated, inviolable, from sancire, this is the Latin, to decree, establish, make binding, place under sacred protection. The Hebrew equivalent is mikdash, and that's what animal sanctuaries are called, a place of holiness, place set apart, related to mishkan or dwelling place. So I really like the overlapping terminology here, set apart and also a place to dwell, right? And that's literally what sanctuaries are. They're literally and figuratively set apart from the rest of the world, and in the sense of, from, let's say, they're outside the animal industrial complex to the extent that they can be. We know that they can't fully be. We've just talked about that. But they are set apart as much as possible, and obviously they're places to dwell. Sanctuaries and the animals that dwell within them are set apart from the dominant ideology and system of violence and are, in this sense, sacred. Though it has all the trappings of the profane, right? Shoveling manure and cleaning, feces off of walls and things like animal feces and so on. Um, Building fences, hammering. That might seem profane, but I actually think it's sacred in many senses of the word. It's a sacred work in the sense that it's set apart from, again, that's the main way I'm using that term. It's devotional work in the sense that we're devoted to, or people who work in sanctuaries are devoted to creating the best conditions possible for other animals. And it's sacred in the sense that it's about nurturing, healing, and fostering the life of those otherwise thrown onto the garbage heap of history. So it actually reclaims the profane and makes it sacred. The animals themselves are the ultimate in profane, in mundane, in nothingness, right? In filth, in our ideology, in the dominant ideology. And so sanctuaries reverse that. Consecrating the desecrated, sanctuaries refuse to participate in the routinized desecration of animal life in factory farms, laboratories, zoos, circuses, fur farms, and other such places. So there's a desecration, I think, of animal life, and that's partly through the physical torture and also the violation of dignity, which I won't get into here. That's a whole other philosophical topic, but I think it's really relevant to animals' experience, the humiliation of animals, etc. By providing succor to the otherwise desecrated, by welcoming those deemed worthless into the community of the worthy, sanctuary workers consecrate animals. They declare them sacred and so shield them from further violation. Now, this is where I get into Simone Weil. So there's something, she says, there is something sacred in every man, but it is not his person, nor yet is it the human personality. It is this man, no more and no less. So what I find fascinating is on the one hand here, she's pointing to the particular. It's this man. But she's also saying it's not the particularities of this man. It's not his personality, his worthiness. The fact that he is a man or she is a woman, she's using man in that traditional sense. She means person here. The fact that a person is a person suggests that there is something sacred. Or let me put it a better way. In every person, irrespective of any other qualities, there is something sacred. And I think that's a really interesting and powerful claim. It can be problematic if it's appropriated by the far right, for example, or in even just sort of right-wing conservative thought around abortion and so on. So that's obviously not the direction I'm going. But I'm interested in the universalization of sacredness. So it's just being a vulnerable living being. So I would go beyond man or person and say vulnerable embodied subject or animal. So the framing universalizes sacredness and further removes from animals the impossible burden of meeting specific criteria in order to be protected from cruelty and extermination, right? We're always saying, oh, but chickens are stupid, blah, blah, blah. And that somehow justifies torturing and killing them. And I'm saying this idea is so powerful as a protest against that, as a intervention against the hyper particularization of value. So I think sacredness provides a defense against arbitrary violence. Sacredness of life, as I just mentioned, can be misused by anti-abortion activists to deny women the right to reproductive autonomy. So that it's not about I'm not interested. I'm not entering into that debate. Where's the cutoff, etc. And certainly don't support the use of that idea for that purpose. Animals killed for sacrifice also carry the mark of the sacred, but in a distorted sense. I already mentioned that here. So sacredness can be an invitation to violence, right? Or can give permission for violence. That's obviously not what I'm interested in. It's in the bolded parts here that where I think the term and the idea have weight. Outside cynical or otherwise troubling interpretation, sacredness can be employed to defend against arbitrary violence against any human being uh, or any animal in any context. It can be invoked to assert the fundamental positive and negative rights of all human beings, irrespective of any other characteristics. So this is following from Weil's argument, but obviously I'm including animals here in the idea. And that will become clear as well as we go along. So now to the third section, talking about blessedness. So here I'm following Andrew Lindsay. Those of you in animal studies may be familiar with him. He's a theologian, Christian theologian. And I'm interested actually in his interpretation, his Christian reading of Bereshit, the story of, there are two chapters of Genesis, chapter 1 and 2, Bereshit 1 and 2. Um, and the blessings, the blessing of beings. So I'm following him really in this idea, and I build upon it and go even further by suggesting that other animals are blessed, and not just the ones in sanctuaries. But I want to revalue animal life by attributing blessedness to those again that are considered sort of the most profane and somehow in contradistinction to blessedness. So creation stories, we're going to look at the two creation stories very briefly. They're characterized by a dynamic of praise. We won't have time to do the textual analysis, obviously, but I'll show you an example of that in a moment. So there are two creation stories. There's a history around the composition. In the first, which is kind of the more systematic one, was actually written later. It's a bit drier. It's not as poetic. Animals and birds are blessed with human beings and with the same blessing. So that's an interesting feature of these stories. One might say then that both humans and other animals are blessed and that animals are blessed beasts. So that's my term. The original state is the state of perfection and one defined by goodness, generosity, abundance, and a certain kind of mutuality. So I'm looking at, and I won't have time, as I keep saying, to show you sort of in greater detail what I mean by that and what Lindsay first and foremost points to. But certainly here he's highlighting these two parts. So you see the arrows. This is after he's created great sea monsters, all the living creatures of every kind that creep, which the waters brought forth in swarms, and all the winged birds of every kind. And God saw that this was good. So first of all, goodness, that's something I'll be developing. God blessed them, saying, be fertile and increase, or be fruitful and multiply, as we know the translation as well. Fill the waters in the seas and let the birds increase on the earth. And then he said this also to humankind, which in the first story he creates in his image. In the second story, it's very different. He creates them out of man, out of clay, Adam, out of Adamah, which is clay. So the term Adam actually relates to that. And then Eve, it comes out of Adam's body. But we'll just stick with this one here. God blessed them to Adam and Eve and said to them, be fertile and increase, fill the earth and master it, right? So here we get to the troubling element that people really focus on, understandably, and rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and all the living things that creep on earth. So that part needs to be critiqued, but a lot of people have already done that. I'm less interested in that actually than I am in the idea that Lindsay introduces, which is they receive the same blessing, at least up to a point. And that recurs throughout the Tanakh, the Jewish Bible. Blessedness. So to receive a blessing, bracha, is to be promised fertility, generativity, and abundance. Yeah, so it's actually not about being made holy in a kind of more superficial sense. It's about um, being fruitful and multiplying, right? So there's a sense of um, flourishing that's associated with blessedness, which I'm really interested in when it comes to other animals. To be blessed, Baruch, is to be praised, adored, and endowed with power. That also interests me. Why are we not adoring rats and mice? Why are we doing what we do to them and treating them like either garbage or just specimens? They are objects of adoration. Certainly, if we conceive of this project sort of in religio or theologico-political terms, they're endowed with a power, right? When we regard them as blessed, then they're endowed with a certain power that we've otherwise denied them. But berech, interestingly, translates directly to me, which could suggest humility. So there's all sorts of theological debate around, is it referring to this Hebrew term, did people used to kneel down? Because that's not part of the Jewish tradition. But maybe in the past it was. Or who knows what the knee actually refers to here. But I like to think of it as a kind of indication of a degree of humility for the humans, not so much for the animals. Oh my goodness, another typo, an extra bullet point. Oh well, I'll let you fill in the gaps. Okay, so for Lindsay, he identifies three elements of blessedness. I'm just going to focus on two. Intrinsic value. We've heard about this from Tom Regan. Those of you anyway who are familiar with animal studies. But I like the way that he frames it here in, I think, richer more less philosophically dry terms, yeah, less legalistic. To affirm the blessedness of creation is to affirm the intrinsic value of all created beings, period. If an animal is blessed, then they are automatically endowed with power and with this sense of intrinsic value. All of creation, even if we don't believe the creation myth, has an irreducible value simply by virtue of having been created. Yeah, so that's a challenge, that's a tension. Of course, the idea that God created all these other beings, maybe that's uncomfortable for some people, but I think we can interpret that creatively, so to speak. All beings and all being participate in God's glory. Nothing and no one God made is extraneous or gratuitous. This is Lindsay's interpretation, right? They were all made deliberately and as an act of love, according to the story. So we don't have to say that we think God did this or God did that. Maybe we don't believe in God, but he's pointing to the fact that in the framing in the story, this is what's happening. Oops, sorry, how do I go back? Uh, in a sense, all that is created is part of God or an extension of him, and all of it has worth because God recognizes its value. God can be interpreted in so many interesting ways as well, right? And that's a whole other project. It doesn't have to be the guy in the sky with the beard. There are many, many powerful mystical ways to understand God, whether or not one is religious. It's not even per se a question of belief, if depending on how creative one wants to be in one's interpretation of the notion, let's say, of God. So freedom is the other point that I mentioned before that Lindsay also talks about. The immanence of God in creation gives it life. The transcendence of God enables it to come into the fullness of its being. So God is not absent, rather he is letting beings be, according to this original story. And it's difficult if I'm not telling you the details of the story. It's hard to maybe for you to follow a little bit this part. But of course, we know that God created the earth and all the animals and human beings in 6 days and rested on the seventh. And so he's looking at how that story unfolded and sort of what God's role in that story is. Part of the blessing of creation is the blessing for creatures to be the beings they are, and specifically through reproduction, humans and other creatures participate in creativity and creation. And I think that's important, not because I um, am supporting a certain attitude towards reproduction per se, but rather we interfere so much in other animals' reproduction, and we take babies away from their mothers for our purposes, causing so much pain and anguish. And so I think actually enabling and supporting other animals' right to reproduce and to be mothers and to be babies and children is really important. So that's quite a radical interpretation that probably isn't meant here, but or at least in the original text. But that's where I'm going with it. Um, and then what Lindsay points out is that creation as envisaged by the priestly writer, so the priestly writer is the writer of the first Genesis story, has as its goal peaceful coexistence with God in a state of perfect freedom. Human beings are set apart, are granted a special freedom, but with this comes a special responsibility. That comes through more in the second story, which is problematic, of course, as well, because it's the responsibility of guarding and protecting and being a steward of the land. So I don't necessarily want to adopt that terminology, but that's where Lindsay is going. The Sabbath is the moment of recuperation, a kind of consummation and fulfillment. All beings rest on the Sabbath, including animals. And this is actually still part of the tradition. Every 7 years, there's meant to be a Sabbath also for the animals, but it's not to say that it's per se, particularly otherwise, pro-animal when we're talking about sort of traditional agricultural practices. I'll be done in just a moment, maybe 5 minutes. The expectation of good, not evil. So it's really important, I think, what Simone Weil expresses here back to her work. At the bottom of the heart of every human being, from earliest infancy until the tomb, there is something that goes on, indomitably expecting, in the teeth of all experience of crimes committed, suffered, and witnessed, that good and not evil will be done to him. It is this above all that is sacred in every human being, and of course, I will add, in every animal. And we know this when we look at a kitten or a lamb, the expression in their face, in their eyes, the expectation is that they will be cared for. I don't think there's much more that needs to be said about that. We violate that expectation. We betray them so profoundly on such a massive scale that it's really an abomination, in my view. And Vey also talks about affliction. I'm not going to get into that here, but obviously all the animals that are not in sanctuaries, and even the ones that are afflicted. They're afflicted. They are experiencing profound suffering, and they're overwhelmed with human evil. And they're starving for human goodness. And I feel that sanctuaries provide that. And I'm not saying that sanctuary workers are saints. I don't want to go that direction. So it's not glorifying or romanticizing, but I think there's something really, really profound happening, and something about counteracting evil with at least an attempt, a genuine effort for goodness. And this is much more of a Christian interpretation. Every time that there arises from the depths of a human heart the childish cry which Christ himself could not restrain, why am I being hurt? Or I prefer, why hast thou forsaken me? Then there is certainly injustice. And we know that animals are crying this out all the time. They're always, they're saying many things with their voices. We just don't listen. And we write it off as, oh, those are just the sounds that chickens make, for example, in a battery farm. No, they're saying something. And I think part of what they're saying is, why hast thou forsaken me? Why have you betrayed me? So sanctuaries, I believe, fulfill the commitment to goodness. They take it as a fundamental truth that each animal expects good to be done to them and not evil, and that to commit evil against them is to desecrate them and to betray them in the most profound way. So I think sanctuaries, without putting it in this terminology necessarily or framing it this way, actually have this as a sort of foundational principle. Whoops, hang on. Yeah, and this is where I'll be getting more into Levinas. Sanctuaries respond to and behave responsibly towards other animals. So Levinas was an ethical thinker, also a Talmudic commentator. I am responsible for a total responsibility, which answers for all the others and for all in the others, even for their responsibility. The I always has one responsibility more than the other. So this puts the weight on the person in power in particular to act responsibly, to respond to hear what they're saying, to see what they're telling you with their bodies, and to act not on their behalf in a paternalistic way, but rather to protect, to come to someone's aid, to support them, to enable them. And to prevent harm coming to them. So this is how one can, and I think Levinas really meant when he spoke about response and responsibility. I also talk about Buber, the I-thou relation. I'm going to skip that here just because we don't have much time, but it's about recognizing the other, the thou, let's say, as a thou, not as a thing, but as a person, using the term broadly, as an animal person. So it's about reestablishing that relation. And that very much happens on sanctuaries where people are in direct contact with other animals and form relationships with them. And also enable other animals to form relationships across species, ideally with each other on their own terms. That's really, really important. And returning to Vey, they enable a kind of attentive silence. So we're always talking about animals, talking at them, never listening to them. And this silence is linked to the I-thou relation and to response and responsibility as proposed by Levinas in the way that I'm interpreting it. To be silent is also to respond, to listen. And this comes also, this is a Veyian concept that has been adopted by by ecofeminist thinkers, and Josephine Donovan, for example, and others, Murdoch, talk about attentive silence and attention. So that's something I'll be building on. Last part, and just the last 2 minutes here. So I feel that they, in one sense, fulfill without completing, let's say, the redemptive project. So they're not the end, right? But the notion of divine redemption is important. I mentioned this already, and it's been adopted by secular thinkers across many disciplines, including psychology, politics, and so on. What I like about it is that it provides a narrative arc and a sense of purpose in history, particularly in the era that we're in, this sort of postmodern, post-everything time where the loss of meaning is somehow celebrated, and I think that's quite dangerous. I think it's important to actually claim meaning in individual life and so in society as a whole and in human history as a whole. I already talked about Marx following Hegel, etc. So there's already a precedent for this. I'm not reinventing the wheel, but I'm following from this tradition. And I think that instead of imagining that we arrive in or that we culminate, the redemptive project culminates in a classless society, we can imagine perhaps as well that it culminates in a speciesless society, meaning we're not differentiating between species. Okay, so this is the Garden of Eden. I'm not going to go into it just for lack of time, but this is in the second story where this is where the Garden of Eden appears. It doesn't appear. It's called Gan Eden in Hebrew. Um, and there are all sorts of interesting and also problematic dynamics that arise in that story. But what I'm interested in is sort of challenging um, uh, some interpretations and sort of developing others. So I'm interested, for example, in naming. So naming is something that Adam is granted the right to do. He's granted the authority to name the other animals, not to dominate them, but to name them in Genesis 2. And I want to say that naming, we can reclaim naming not as an act of power or ownership, but as an act of love, right? So when you name someone, when you name a child and you name an animal friend, you're actually endowing them with thou-ness, right? You're recognizing the person there. Working and guarding the garden, so that tends to be interpreted as stewardship, but we can also reinterpret that as nourishing and protecting the earth and its inhabitants in a less paternalistic sense, in a more humble sense. There's a vegan imperative that's established. Actually, of course, that's not the wasn't the intention, but we can certainly work with the idea that no animals were killed or eaten in the garden, and everybody ate plants, and that's it, very explicitly. And then a call to a restoration of a kind of primordial innocence, not an innocence that ever existed. When I say primordial, I don't mean primitive, quote unquote. I mean profound. Something, there's an innocence that we long for where there isn't violence. And I think that we can work with that longing that we might have, that we might repress, but that I think on some level it appears across literature, philosophy, and so on. So as I said, it's an origin and a destination, Eden. So in some narratives, right? So we know that traditionally it's the origin, and then there's the idea is to be we were expelled because we ate of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the idea is that we will be able to return. There are all sorts of scholarly debates and theological debates on that. I'm interested in Carolyn Merchant's argument that we don't rely too heavily on a notion of return or recovery, and instead call for a new story for the 21st century, following her. Yeah, she says, let's not imagine going back. And let's not imagine reappropriating Eden in a really cynical way that some people do, like making beautiful gardens for the rich or something, right? And gated communities. She also says that's a kind of Eden narrative there. Let's reinvent, not reinvent, let's invent a new story. And I think she's right. I'm not going to, these are the sort of the details of her argument. And this is where she says we need to find a new story, and that's what I'm interested in. And I think the new story is something. Whoop, hang on, got too excited there. The new story is something that I don't know what it is yet. I think it's something for us to write. So there's something really open there for us to consider and to work together to create. So it's not that the story's been written; it's that we need to write the story, but we can take inspiration from these ancient traditions that have written a kind of story for us. Okay, that's it. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you so much. That was really a great kind of comprehensive look at like so many of the themes that you're dealing with in your project, and I'm sure it's making everybody kind of look forward to the written work when it comes out. So thank you. We have a few questions. I'm going to just dive right in, but I do want to ask one brief question, and I don't really know. Hopefully, we'll definitely get to all of them. And I guess my first question, because in my research on sanctuaries too, it comes not as like a but, it's more like a yes and. And what I mean
Hmm.
by that is that in my understanding of the history of sanctuaries is that the idea is that sanctuary is a place where sacred objects were at least kept, and that the place itself became sacred. And
Hmm.
one aspect of sacredness is that it cannot be violated, right? It cannot be entered, say, by the authorities. So if you
Hmm.
were a fugitive, you're like, okay, I'm going to go into the place where the authorities can't go. But it's not really intended to house me per se. It's a place that because it cannot be penetrated, I go because I'm unreachable.
Yes.
And so when I think of how we just kind of adopted the term animal sanctuary 50 years ago, it just started to become part of the language. When in my mind, I think more about asylum. I think more about refugee camps. Like if I look at the definition, like the UN definition of refugee camps, it sounds exactly what we're doing in animal sanctuaries, which these are places who are fleeing violence, persecution, and have nowhere to go in many ways. So I guess I'm just kind of curious that I really appreciate your approach because now it's actually talking about the sacredness of life itself and animals themselves. But is there some space, especially if we're looking at sanctuaries as, say, political refusal, that it also makes sense to really integrate the kind of history of asylum, right? Which literally means something like free from violation, like it's not allowed to be violated. So is it kind of a both and from your perspective?
Oh, absolutely. And I actually didn't mention that about the idea of the sort of the history of sanctuaries as providing refuge to fugitives. This also applies in Jewish thought as well. Sort of when you look at the history of the idea of that space that's set apart. So if someone maybe killed someone accidentally, but were being pursued by the law, so to speak, then they could seek refuge there. That was one reason. So there's that history that's very interesting. I just didn't bring it up here because it doesn't directly apply and had so many things to cover, but certainly in a chapter on sort of the history of sanctuary and what it means in terms of human beings and sort of
Yeah.
what the function of the sanctuary was. I'll be getting into that.
No,
Um,
it makes sense to me. I just want to interrupt because it's like because of this kind of sentimentality we often people are have around animals and the way that animal lovers and their sanctuaries sometimes depoliticizes it when we start talking about animal refugee camps, animal asylums, I think we get back into some
Yes, and I
political
actually
issues.
gave a talk on the notion of on the legal status of animals in sanctuaries, and it was in a kind of thought experiment. I gave it with with a colleague, and we in Vienna recently we talked about floating the idea of animals being legally named refugees, so that they're protected from
Mm,
seizure from the state, like this happened in a pig sanctuary in Italy. You may have heard of it. So I've explored that idea. I'm a little uncomfortable with the way the notion of refugee has developed in this historical moment. And I'm also, very, very critical and skeptical of the human rights institutions for reasons I'm not going to get into here. So I don't take what they say and their definitions necessarily
mhm.
at face value. I'm very skeptical of the sort of history um, of this whole institutionalization of the notion of refugee.
Yeah, of
Um,
borders themselves, yeah, of course.
Not so much of borders. I'm not necessarily an anarchist. I'm not against borders, but I'm critical of the way the notion of refugee has been used in certain contexts. And so I'm not sure what to do, where to go with that, but I think it's important, and it could be something. There's a lot there, and also the idea of asylum. I actually originally had thought about framing sanctuaries more as spaces of like the underground, part of sort of an underground railway.
Mm,
So that was another framework, but then I thought that doesn't actually really fit in the same way. So in this talk, and this, I don't know if I'm going to do a separate book or this will be sort of part two of a larger book. This is where I've focused more on the theological elements here. In the sanctuaries as refusal part, I'm talking really more about the political. But for me, I guess what I'm trying to get at is that I think in political thought, I think sanctuaries in themselves are political acts. And I tried to make that
mm,
clear at the beginning. So I don't feel, both symbolically and materially, I don't feel that we need to prove our politics always by necessarily fitting into certain categories. I think that the theological framing, sort of the secular framing of theological ideas and terms, is political as well. By calling an animal blessed and not sacrificing the animal, killing the animal, for me is a political intervention. So I didn't maybe state that so much here,
mm.
but that's the implication
Great,
that
great.
was there for me. Yeah.
Okay, so before I get scolded for not getting into these questions. Now I'm gonna, but I really interested in that one aspect. I mean, I took lots of questions and notes, but let's go to the comments and questions. So, Vasile, Dr. Senescu asks, I am interested in your account of evil and animal exploitation, which you mentioned as part of your research, but have not yet addressed today. If Arendt's banality of evil challenges the idea that evil is always demonic or monstrous, what might this mean for animal exploitation, where sincere and ordinary people participate in immense violence without seeing themselves as cruel? And in that context, might veganism be understood, even for a secular person, as a spiritual practice, a refusal of ordinary violence, and perhaps even a form of holiness?
So I'll answer yes to that last question. And I think that the banality, I think that um, evil, so is banal. For it's not evil isn't sadism necessarily, right? So and I think that I was just looking at the question here. Oh, where did it go? It disappeared. Okay. That yes, I didn't explore Arendt's definition because there's only so much time, but I certainly take from her the idea of evil's banality, and that's what actually makes it in a way even more evil because it happens without any concern whatsoever. It's just ticking numbers. Now it's algorithms and whatever else. But the whether you're preparing a list of people to be exterminated in the gas chambers as part of your 9 to 5 job, or you're preparing a list of animals to be exterminated as part of your 9 to 5 job, then you're participating. You yourself aren't necessarily evil, but you're participating in an evil system. Um, uh, was there something else in the question that I missed? I was looking, trying to look at it because it was a
Yeah, sorry, I just
multi-layered
added under
question.
the answered question. It asked,
Where is it? Ah, okay.
what
Yeah.
might, well, I guess also there's, yeah, I don't know if
Part
you
of
can
your
see it
question.
now under the answered question.
Yes. I do. Okay. What might that mean for animal exploitation? Like,
Sorry, I don't know why that
I
keeps
think it's
refreshing.
demonic and monstrous what we do to animals, and I think it's important that we name that. Um, I understand why people shy away from that, and I'm certainly not interested in individualizing that, in parsing blame, to individual workers in the sanctuary, for example, for being evil. But the practices are evil, and so I think that's yeah, that's all I'll say on that point.
Okay. The next question is from Diana Hewlett, who asks, if Kodesh means set apart from mundane use and consecrated to one's God, could sanctuary fulfill that intention more completely than sacrifice? The animal is still removed from agricultural use, still consecrated, but they live into the offering rather than dying into it. I am thinking of the Buddhist practice of Fang Shang, releasing animals as a meritorious act where the blessing flows from the animal's life and freedom, not their death.
That's a really nice way to frame it. Yeah. In this project so far, I haven't involved Buddhism in the conversation, but it's definitely something to think about. And I really liked what you said, live into the offering rather than dying into it. Yeah, and the trick is, I don't want it to be, I'm not trying to make it precious. And I'm not trying to say, oh, there's these, one a beautiful, perfect plate. I hope that's clear. These are, difficult places, hard work schedules. Like I have a whole section on that in my paper, and that will be in my book too, the reality of living and working on a sanctuary, both for humans and other animals. But so it's not like there's a halo around everybody, but an offering can be interpreted more broadly, right? That uh, without putting too much emphasis on the human who's doing the offering, right? It's more just creating the conditions for the animal to self-liberate, because I don't want it to be about, oh, we're doing this wonderful thing by not killing them and instead releasing them in that case, right? So, but I think that's a really beautiful way to frame it. And it's also interesting to think about acts of liberation like that, where you don't bring them into a consecrate to a sanctuary, but there's a consecration through release. So thank you for that note. I'll keep that in mind.
And it also seems to have precedent in ancient traditions of sacrifice, at least as I know in South Asia, where there were kind of turns to
Mm.
ritual offerings. We're trying to have like surrogates
Yes,
for
yes,
surrogates, right? You're having like surrogates
yes.
for surrogates when you
Yeah,
start to look at the history of
absolutely.
animal sacrifice itself. So then you have a situation where it becomes even more, the surrogate is unnecessary, right? You're capturing spirit instead of content. And so I think that's well stated in this question as well.
Very much. Thank you.
Okay, let's keep going. Agni Hogambum says, thank you for a fantastic talk. As a background for my question, I'm an ethical vegan doing my thesis work in sanctuary. In their paper, Farmed Animal Sanctuaries, Donaldson and Kimlicka identify several tensions in even the most ethical sanctuaries, including association, environment, and work. Work, sorry, I don't clearly like to work in some way. It is important that we who run or support sanctuaries do not instrumentalize or profit from their work, of course. However, some leftists believe that work is purely a capitalist or colonial construction, artificial or corrupt in some way. My questions are, do you think work has a place in utopian constructions?
So yeah, I love that paper by Donaldson and Kimlicka. It's really, really important, and they really set the stage for reimagining sanctuaries as multi-species communities. I'm a little bit less concerned about sort of politicizing sanctuaries in the way that they suggest here. I think sanctuaries can be structured in many different ways and still be doing great political work, but I won't get into that side of their piece. In terms of work, that's a great question. So I don't think work per se has to be exploitative, but I think if someone is compelling another to work for them, is instrumentalizing another in order to gain some kind of profit, material or otherwise, then that's where we get into problematic territory. And I think so animals working, I mean, for me, in my experience and in what I've read about work is really because my work on animal assisted therapy, for example, very most animals would rather not. Some dogs might be okay with it, because for some dogs, and it really depends on the individual, having a task to complete is exciting, and depending on how all the other conditions around that, um, it might be something that is really fulfilling for that particular animal, and that could include doing care work for a human being, an injured or traumatized human being. So some forms of work, but certainly I would say the emphasis should be on, if possible, creating a post-work society,
Mm.
but that involves projects and sort of collaboration and individual creation and productivity defined outside of this understanding of work that you rightly pointed out is very much right now filtered through the sort of capitalist lens. So I'm going to say that it's really up to the animals. If they feel somehow they're showing interest in doing something in particular, then great. But my experience is that that's not really the case, that they are living their lives in different ways that don't per se involve work as we understand it.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that's also a misnomer when people say like, no one wants to work anymore or things like that. And it's like,
Right.
no one ever wanted to do alienated wage work. No one
Yes,
ever wanted to do that ever in feudal society and capitalist society. No one ever wanted to do that. So I think we have to be very precise when we use the language
exactly.
work. Are we talking about having
Yes,
projects, having goals, having interests?
right.
Well, a lot of people like to do that. But what happens when you take the thing that I'm working on out of my hands and commodify it and sell it or have give me no say at all in what I'm working on? Okay, then maybe I don't want to work
That's it.
anymore.
And when it
And
comes
I
to other
think you'd
animals,
also
it's that
agree
much
from
trickier.
sanctuary work. I guess you're saying from sanctuary work that like you probably have encountered animals like some who like to work, like Tina likes to work, but like
Yeah.
Fluffy doesn't,
Yeah, she may.
and
And also what they're doing is maybe they're working in ways that we don't recognize. Like when they're so
Mm,
is working building a nest, is working building a
mhm,
sand bath. So I was on a sanctuary where Javi, a big pig, built himself on a sort of not a daily basis, but like every week or two, he would build a new pond for himself. That's maybe work.
mm,
And sure, he should absolutely have, be we should enable that, because it's fulfilling for
yes.
him not just to lie in the mud bath, but I think to also create the mud bath. So that kind of work absolutely should be promoted in the sense that we should create the conditions for it to happen and to unfold naturally.
Mm, yeah, beautiful. Tracy Glover has a comment. Thank you for your wonderful work. These ideas of secular sacredness and values like ahimsa are very much alive at my sanctuary. I appreciate this framing so much. And though I'm also not traditionally religious, I see the sacred all around me in the lives of both the rescued animals and the wild animals here. It's very nice
Thank you. And I
sentiment.
just want to say, I want to give a shout out to sanctuary workers because I don't feel that sanctuaries have gotten enough attention in animal studies. And that's part of the motivation behind this project as well, is to center animal sanctuaries, and to center the people who do this really, really difficult, physically difficult and emotionally taxing work. And so I'm glad that this project resonates, and that people feel seen in the movement, because I do think that they're often sidelined, and sort of invisible. So yeah,
No,
just
I
to
think
follow up
that's a
from
great
that.
point, right? Everyone wants to rescue animals, but how many want to actually take care of the animals then for the rest of their lives and take them to their doctor visits and
Oh my goodness, and
sleep
stay
with
up,
them and
24/7 with
exactly.
babies and dealing with also like really injured and traumatized animals going
Mm.
into horrible situation. I mean, really,
And like
it's
death on
really
a near
brave
daily
work.
and death on a near daily basis of
Absolutely.
lots of animals.
Loss.
It's brutal.
Yeah, it
Paul
is.
Murphy has a comment and a question, I think, here. I'm aware of a sanctuary near me where the person in charge does almost everything alone and to the point of neglect. Not necessarily evil,
Mm.
but definitely not being responsible. This person also doesn't own the property and therefore cannot have a trust. what is to be done with the
Yeah.
animals in this case if something happens to this person?
Yeah, that's an example of the sanctuary that means well, but actually is not able to do the work that it wants to do. And I do think that and so harm can be done accidentally, certainly not evil. It's unintentional.
Mm,
I've visited a sanctuary like that too. And yes, the animals were free comparatively, but they had, lesions and, veterinary issues, medical issues that weren't being seen to. So I don't have your answer. It would depend. I don't have an answer for you specifically in this case. It's really, I don't know the details, and I'm not an authority on what to do, but certainly, this person requires more support from the sounds of it. And if not, I think that, finding another sanctuary ultimately with more resources or collaborating with another sanctuary might be something to suggest, because going it alone, then you burn yourself into the ground, run yourself into the ground, and the animals in the end also suffer. And it's not about martyrdom, right? In my view,
yeah.
like, and I don't want to speak for sanctuary people because I don't run a sanctuary, but from the outside, I don't think anybody expects martyrdom, nor should we. And we certainly want animals to be in safe, healthy places. That's the whole idea. That's the whole point. So, yeah,
I
there's,
see. I mean, I think that's also a question you said earlier and I don't want to spend too much time, and there's two more questions here, but in my experience with those, I mean, I've volunteered and spent time in sanctuaries, but those who operate them, there seems to be this, I just want to say this like awful dilemma between recognizing on the one hand that when you rescue an animal, it means everything to that individual, but we also can't rescue ourselves out of the problem, right?
right.
So
Yeah,
it's
but
it's this constant
yes.
kind of trouble, right? Of like, people want to mean well because it means everything to get that animal up. But do you have the capacity? Do you have the ability to kind of ensure longevity in that rescue? And it's just I don't have an answer. I just mean that it just seems to be such a hard space to live in, whether it's one person rescuing or a larger sanctuary.
So there's a woman who runs a sanctuary called Greyton Farm Animal Sanctuary in South Africa. I'll be spending time with her in the winter, doing research and working on this book. She has talked about having a kind of manual for people who want to start a sanctuary, because
Hmm.
people have this great idea, or they might start, not collecting, but right, there's an injured animal there and there's another one there. And they think, you know what? Okay, I've got to save more and more. But they're actually not equipped, not because they're
Hmm.
anything to do with them as people, but they are financially and otherwise not equipped, even emotionally. And she feels that it's important that people take that very seriously,
Hmm.
that there should be a much more support within the sanctuary movement and more advice from people who run successful sanctuaries like hers that do have proper funding, that do, also have to draw lines. Unfortunately, it's the Sophie's choice of sanctuaries, right? Saying no to some animals.
Yeah.
But in order to preserve the integrity of the sanctuary and make sure you can afford to keep up the animals that are there. So all of these difficult things, I think people often really need guidance in how to do this. And so I really support her idea of kind of developing sort of a resource for future sanctuaries, sanctuary owneries, to look to
Mm.
avoid falling into these problems.
Right. And there's also the sense that the animal in need tomorrow is no less in need than the one today, honestly, in some ways. So if you
That
exercise a
too,
form
and
of patience, like exercise a form of patience and preparation, because in 2 years, there's going to be plenty of animals that still need attention as today, and you might be more equipped in 2 years if you've laid some of the
I
groundwork
see
and
what you
set
mean.
yourself in place. I mean, like people, there's so much this urgency. Like, what am I doing
Yeah.
today?
Yes.
But we're in a
Yes.
place right now where it's not like there's not going to be just not as many, if not even more, animals in need in 2 years, in 5 years, in 10 years. So, but it's hard. I think
Yes.
on the
Absolutely.
affective level, I think it's hard for people not to want to
And politically,
manifest that
do I
compassion.
feed the yeah, I think it's one of those sort of, there's no single answer to it, but
Yeah,
one has to be practical and reasonable about what one can do and what one can't do
yeah.
for everybody's
So,
sake.
Jay Tuxney Hewitt asks, you spoke briefly about attentive silence. Could you say more about this idea and how it relates to developing right relationships with animals?
Yeah, I sped through that quote as I realized I was taking up a lot of time. So, if I can find it here at somewhere back there. Um, oh, I don't know. But the idea of attentive silence is paying attention to, so not speaking for someone, right? So this is challenging the idea of also having a voice for animals, that as if they don't have a voice. So first, learning how to listen. And attentiveness is this idea, and Vey and others go into this in much greater detail. And I'm just beginning kind of to look into the scholarship around attention. But I'll read the quote here. So, what is first needed is a system of public education capable of providing it, so far as possible, with means of expression. And next, a regime in which the public freedom of expression is characterized not so much by freedom as by an attentive silence in which this faint and inept cry can make itself heard. And finally, institutions are needed of a sort which will, so far as possible, put power into the hands of men, people who are able to and anxious to hear and understand it. So, what I'm interested in is especially this part here, because we had talked about that cry earlier. So that's what the it is here. That there's this desire for goodness, right? An expectation of goodness, and then sort of the cry of injustice being done to one. And so we need to listen to that. And we can start, I don't know where that was. I'll just leave it. We can start, first of all, by recognizing that animals speak, right? That the sounds are not just empty utterances or vocalizations, as the industry likes to say. It's not a vocalization, it's a form of speech. And when someone is being tortured, also in the case of humans, you're not using words anymore. You no longer have the capacity to express through language. So I actually think it goes beyond language anyways, extreme violence. So it's learning how to listen, but then in that cry, even if there are no words there, there's an obvious I think two-part sort of thing a message being communicated. One is, why hast thou forsaken me? And two, please help me. Stop doing this. And then beyond that, right? Then we start to listen. Once we're out of the crisis situation and we're in a safer environment, then we start to really look and learn. Like, what is this animal telling me with her facial expressions, with her bodily movements? What about where she tends to go on one day or another? Is she telling me that she would like to have some more private space? Is she telling me she wants to dig a little hole in this area that right now is blocked off? So maybe I can accommodate that. So translating kind of these deeper ideas into very practical things, which you see happening on sanctuaries where people are attentive to what the animals are saying. So that's what I'm referring to in this case.
Great. So just two more questions. One is the first question from Maria Martelli, who says, thank you for your presentation. Do you have in mind any examples of prioritizing certain kinds of expensive care, say for ill or elderly animals, versus taking in new or healthy animals, and how these choices are narrated morally and politically? I think we touched on this for a moment, but
Right.
more to say.
Yeah, I don't have oh, sorry. Were you going to say something?
No, no, no,
Okay.
no.
Yeah, I don't have the answer to that. I just know that, like I said, it's a Sophie's choice. I know that it's really devastating. And this is why I think also sanctuary workers need to be supported and cared for, and provided with more support from the movement because of the choices and the trauma, really, actually, that they experience and encounter on a daily basis, including choosing who lives and who dies, or who comes to the sanctuary and who doesn't, who is admitted, who is refused. I don't feel that I'm qualified to provide an answer to that question. Otherwise, to say that I think all the all the authentic sanctuaries make that decision in good faith always, and they have to sort of see what's available to them. Some sanctuaries do. I know one sanctuary in Ontario that was only admitting healthy animals.
Hmm.
That was a choice that the person made for whatever number of factors. It wasn't because they were a bad person that didn't care about unhealthy animals, but because they felt that in the small, I remember now specifically, part of the reason was the small environment that she had. She wanted to make sure that animals could learn to interact, that were coming from various places sort of more easily to facilitate that. I don't know that unhealthy animals would have had a harder time with that, but her idea was somehow
Hmm.
that it would be easier for her to transition into a sanctuary by first at least admitting only healthy animals.
Makes me think about how we're kind of in a loose sense, everyone's a philosopher, you know what I mean? Every act like we're not in philosophy, but you come up to these tough decisions and
Right.
everybody has some philosophy. It reminds me of like Aldous Huxley used to say, like, Everyone has a philosophy, so the decision's not between philosophy and no philosophy. It's just a good one or a bad one.
Right, right.
And I just like I think
Yeah.
like Marie is asking too, like what happens in the real world? As in some ways, I have to be a philosopher because I don't know how to figure out these
Or
situations.
the opposite, or you have to just be very concrete and practical, or and think in terms of what can I do, what can't I do, what makes sense to me right now, and what doesn't, what will work best. So it's almost avoiding the sort of philosophical framing and more just getting right down to business, right?
Okay. All
But
right.
but
So
I think both apply.
yeah. So
Yeah,
a little bit over, but I would want to know that I don't know if this last question will get in, but Agni did ask one more question before the time. But the last question, maybe our questioner can even send that to you via email, which I dropped in the chat. But Agni says that you had
sure.
mentioned that sanctuaries are a fake freedom. More and more human beings are also living in a fake freedom. Along the lines of Merchant, I have often thought it isn't wise to overemphasize and constantly deconstruct problems, not because these things aren't important, but because this triggers human beings' fear response and they have less access to their cognitive functions. Are we activists and academics, excuse me, doing enough for nervous
Salute.
system repair for ourselves and others, or are we essentially overemphasizing, talking, and analyzing?
So that's, I think, if I understand your question correctly, I'll take it more as a comment that we need to be providing more care. And I know that can sort of seem cheesy or difficult to, what does that mean? But I think, yes, so we can get really hoity-toity philosophical and theological about it. But at the end of the day, the reason for looking to these theories, at least for me, is about finding ways to um, let's say to kind of have a paradigm shift based on care as opposed to domination and violence. But the care has to include care for the humans. I myself feel that, as an activist, not a sanctuary owner or founder or worker, except for volunteering here and there, but just being an activist and looking at footage of animals being abused and tortured and killed for many, many years, I sort of shut down and lost. I can't look at those images anymore, and shifted to sanctuaries actually as for part of that reason, as an act of self-care. Like I'm not going to help anybody if I'm on the floor crying and shaking, uh, on a daily basis because of the images that I'm seeing and the suffering that I'm witnessing. And so I think we also have to make choices in our advocacy about what we're able to handle, but we also have to support each other. And that's again why I do want to raise the profile of sanctuaries, because I think they can't. And I know this from other people who do frontline work in human crises as well. They put their own needs aside, and that can destroy someone, right? When you're constantly saving others and you really do harm to yourself. So I think it's really important that we make that clear that people shouldn't be martyring themselves,
Mm.
but we need to provide the support for them as well.
I like the framing that someone told me, which was make yourself essential but not indispensable. Um,
Right.
right. So
Yeah, that's a really
the
nice way to put it. Yeah.
especially because if you start to hold yourself up as like you're the one holding everything together, right? And then that leads to also kind
Yes.
of ego formation that isn't positive either. Um, but
Sure.
obviously, if you could build a kind of
Yeah.
community where people are like, hey, I need to take 2 weeks off to take care of
Yes.
myself, everyone should say, no problem, we have your back.
Exactly. And I
We
know
don't.
sanctuaries,
No, go ahead.
they can't sorry, I got so excited. So I thought of something. So sanctuaries can't afford to pay their workers, to give them more than, let's say, 2 weeks a year paid leave. And to me, that's just, I understand, and I'm not judging the sanctuaries for doing that because I understand the limitations, but maybe there's another way
Mm.
to do it so that they can have more time off than that, because I just don't know how sustainable that is for anybody.
That makes sense. Well, there's another question. I really think we just should. We're a bit over time already, but I hope I gave your email in the chat, and I really
Okay,
hope that anybody
great.
who
Yeah.
attended to ask questions, who had a question, didn't ask it, had a thought, didn't say it. I'm sure you're really eager, and I can tell from interacting with you, you just kind of love workshopping and brainstorming and talking about these issues. So I hope they do reach out. And I just
Absolutely. Anybody's welcome to.
so I just want to say formally, thank you so much for being here with us today and giving us this window into your current work. And I just want to thank you for all the work you just do for animals and humans along the way.
Thank you. Likewise, I follow your work, and it's really informative, and also it is really helpful for this project as well. And thank you for your questions, Jonathan, and everybody else for your
Great.
for taking the time today. Thank you.
So thank you all so much. I hope you'll join us in a month's time for a talk by Dr. Vasile Stanescu. Pay attention to what we're doing on our website, on Facebook, on Instagram, and you can kind of see when that event's coming up. You can register at arihuntainstitute.org for our newsletter, in which case you'll also get emails about these coming events. So once again, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you in a month's time.